Welcome to Classical Education, a podcast for those who believe in rediscovering the art of asking questions, engaging in conversation, and attending to the ideas at the heart of well-ordered teaching and learning. I invite you to join me on a journey in pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful as a participant in the great conversation, and listen to the many voices coming from the world of classical education. Many of you know that this podcast is produced by Beautiful Teaching. Today's guest has just joined the Beautiful Teaching consulting team. Mark Signorelli currently serves as headmaster at Lumen Gentium Academy, a classical Catholic school located in New Jersey, and he has over 20 years of experience as an educator. He's also written extensively for a wide variety of journals, his own site, The Classical Corner, and has authored several books. Through Beautiful Teaching, Mark is offering a few 2-hour sessions this summer on teaching history classically, as well as a session on a metic approach to poetry. These courses are open for registration now. Visit our registration page at beautifulteaching.coursestorm.com, beautifulteaching.coursestorm.com. Enjoy the show. Down with the research paper is an essay that Mark wrote that captured my attention. He says, a good writer is one who is conversant with his sources, who thinks about life's perennial mysteries alongside them, and invites his reader into the polyphonous discussion he is already undertaking with his sources. A good high school writing assignment is one that invigorates such a discussion. We do not want our students to write about books, but to write about life, using books to expand and synthesize their thoughts. How far removed is the ubiquitous research paper from any such conception? Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Adrian. It's great to be here.
Today, what we're going to talk about is 2 of your essays that you've written that I have read a few times and I think are quite provocative and important for our listeners to have an experience with. So we're going to walk through a couple of these essays, and hopefully our listeners will visit your Substack, sign up, and read your brilliant papers that I think are such a blessing. So the first article is called Down with the Research Paper, and the second is called Some Principles for a Classical Writing Program. And I love both of these. I think both of them I actually did post on our Facebook group at some point because I loved them when I read them. This first essay, Down with the Research Paper, the title is quite provocative and the message is somewhat as well. It definitely captured my attention. And so it may be hard for some people to swallow. The second one, I think, is a bit more palatable as it lends itself towards a poetic emphasis towards writing. But my first question in this research paper topic is to ask you to tell us more about your thesis and reason for writing an essay that essentially condemns the research paper.
Yeah, sure. So I think the simple answer to that, as the simple answer to why I wrote an essay condemning the research papers, I had to teach the damn thing for so many years, and it drove me crazy. It drove my students crazy, and it drove me crazy to drive my students crazy. And I suppose that it was a long held grudge against the assignment that got expressed in that essay. I think the experience of teaching the research paper was an experience of not providing our students with what they needed, right? It was a kind of strange experience to be, talking about the niceties of MLA format, right? Or telling my students about the proper margins for a block quote, and teaching that to rooms full of students who had yet to gain command of the structure of an English sentence, right? And it did seem, in many ways, to be a clear-cut case of misplaced priorities, right? That we had lost sense of what was fundamental, and we're really kind of focused on the peripheral. But in a kind of general way, the approach of research, the very conception of research, as time went on, became more and more foreign to what I thought I was trying to do as a teacher, and what I was doing myself as a writer in my own writing, and what I would was calling or inviting our students to do in their own studies. The research paper is kind of a hallmark or staple of high school curricula, and it's generally, if not universally, justified on the grounds that this is the kind of writing that students are going to do in college, right? That this is
Hmm.
academic writing, that we are preparing them for their future academic careers when they move to college. This is the kind of writing that they're going to take, that they're going to be required to produce. And so the basic thesis of that article is that, as classical educators, that's not, preparing students for college is not the end all be all of the purposes of what we're trying to do, right? I mean, and we have to, you always have to be clear and qualify that statement, right? It's not to say that we don't think that the education we're offering is going to prepare students for college. In fact, I think we're all confident that our students come out way better prepared for academic work, future academic work, than students in comparable programs. But that happens almost as a kind of byproduct or side effect of
Right.
what we're doing, right? It's not the main. We're trying to prepare them for life and the totality of life, which includes future academic work. So since we don't take college preparation to be the end all be all of the ends of the education that we're trying to provide, the research paper, which has its justification in exclusively in that purpose, ought not to provide the model for a classical writing program, right? Since those purposes are not our purposes, or not the entirety of our purposes, the research paper does not really serve our purposes.
Mhm. So if in a classical school, college is not really the focus, right? How do you think that this goal that, or I think you said these misplaced priorities, this is a big misplaced priority. How do you think that this focus, which I know a lot of parents will send their kids to classical schools because they'll think it's going to prepare them for college, the same idea. So, how does that goal influence the curricular choices in the pedagogy of an English class? And why should the classical tradition reject that goal?
Yeah, I think so. In the first, I mean, to make a qualification, the question, the issue is complicated by the fact that our colleges are a mess, right? I mean, to
Mm-hmm.
put it politely. Because our colleges are not teaching in any our students of anything of substance, right? Because they have lost sight of their own goals, so thoroughly. It the idea of having the preparation of our students for college as a primary goal seems less and less relevant to what we're doing, right? If we're talking about like sending students off to study with John Witherspoon at Princeton, I'm willing to concede that college preparation might be something more that we would be willing to encompass in our curricular goals, but that's just not the case. But putting that aside, I mean, so what scholars do, what professors do, what scholarship looks like at the level of academia is primarily writing about other writing, right? A scholar goes back to the sources, goes back to the literature, and writes about it. All right, and that's kind of the basic task that's involved in scholarship. And I suppose the basic departure that I am suggesting is that we don't want students at a high school level, and certainly before that, writing primarily about other writing. We want them writing about life, right? We want them writing about human experience, and using other writing to enhance their ability to do that, to carry out that task. But the task is contemplating and ruminating upon experience itself. All right. So um, the basic model for for high school instruction, right? The basic response to reading that students do in writing, right? Or the basic relationship between reading and writing that obtains in a non-classical school is effectively analytical, right?
Hmm.
So students read a piece of writing, all right? They read a poem, let's say, and then they're asked to analyze that poem. They say what that poem is about. All right. Tell
Hmm.
analyze the figures of speech that are used here. Explain how Shakespeare uses metaphor to express a Platonic conception of love, or something along those lines. Right. So the response to reading a work of literature is to write about that work of literature. Right. And that is completely non-classical, right? As a completely
Yes.
non-classical approach, right? If
Yep.
classical education aims to recapture let's say mainstream tradition of Western pedagogy and appropriate it for our own times, right? Well, if you go back to that tradition, that is not at all the way students were taught to respond to writing, to
Right.
reading, all right?
Right.
Um, they were invited to respond to the reading that they did by imitating it, right? Not writing about the things that they read, but writing the kinds of things that they read. Right. So, a student would spend hours poring over the Georgics or the eclogues of Virgil. Right. And then they would try their hand at some Latin hexameters. Right. They would do the sort of thing that Virgil was doing. Right. Or they would read a speech by Cicero, and then they would give a speech of their own employing the same kind of rhetorical techniques that
Mhm.
Cicero had employed, right? They did the sort of things that those writers were doing. They weren't writing about them, right? So that's the basic distinction I'm aiming at. And which the research paper does not encompass at all, but which most of the kind of writing that students do in school, particularly in their humanities classes and English classes, they don't do that sort of thing either, right? And I think that the key thing to say there, and I think this is, to your point about like what makes this kind of writing classical, it's because the aim then is to keep students focused on the fundamental questions of human life, right? Which is where we want their focus at all times, right? When you're imitating a style, your focus is on the content, the subject matter, and you're using that style as a way to into that subject matter, right? So my line when I taught literature was I don't teach literature, or I teach life, and I use literature to help me do that, right? So like when I'm reading Shakespeare with my students, I don't want them thinking about Shakespeare. I want them thinking about life with Shakespeare's help. All right. And
Right.
so when we're carrying out the writing assignment that follows from the reading, we in some way we wanted to encompass that sort of task.
Yeah, that's great. And so what you're talking about is mimesis. So we're just going to
Mhm.
go back to
Yeah.
Aristotle here, the
Yeah.
very Aristotelian and mimetic teaching. And that just means imitation. And what I think can happen for a teacher who may be new to classical education or may not fully understand what mimetic teaching is, it's simply imitation. It's not complicated. There's really no steps towards how to imitate. It's just learning to imitate. A baby, that's how they learn. They learn by imitation. There's no like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 steps to imitate. They just imitate, right? And so, as a teacher, you have to be very aware of what texts you're giving your students because you want to give them the best so that they imitate that which is good and true and beautiful, and they have the opportunity to wrestle with the ideas that are in even the text, so they can learn how to think about, oh, how does this text hit me, right, in a sense. But yet at the same time you want to be careful, oh, I'm not inserting all my opinions, right? But you're wrestling with it. And this is why I always go back to narration being such an important part, especially for learning how to write well. Because if they are always having an experience of retelling what they have read, as long as what they have read is good and true and beautiful and done well, and they're putting it into their own words, using some of the vocabulary to express in their own words what they just read, they're actually learning how to think. And one of the things I see as a theme in your both of your essays is that what you're really wanting is that the student to learn how to think and read well, because they're not going to be able to write well if they can't do that. So expand on that.
Yeah, and that's a really fundamental point, which maybe this might be the place to start. When we're talking about writing instruction, right? We're talking about reading, right? I mean, there's one basic way you learn how to write, and that's by reading a lot, right? And there's no surrogate for that, right? So over the years, I've had numerous conversations with parents who recognize that their students are struggling to write, and you would be able to tell that those students were not always keeping up with the reading. And I think sometimes parents are looking for kind of a quick and easy fix for that, right?
Hmm.
What is the writing instruction you can provide for my child at this point, at this juncture, to get them writing back? And the answer is right is that's more of a long term. We're looking at more long-term solutions. They just have to read more, right? And there really is no way of becoming an adept writer, a writer with facility with the language, unless you've kind of imbibed those structures through lots and lots of reading, right? So when we turn then to the writing task, and the writing task that's related to the reading in some way. We want that writing task to enhance the students' reading, right? To encourage them to go back, or to invite them to go back to the text in some meaningful way, and to appropriate that text in a deeper way than they did, let's say, on a first and cursory reading. So in a sense, then I'm conceiving of the writing assignment as an adjunct to the reading assignment, right? As a way of getting them back to the text and reading more astutely. And we're doing some of this sort of thing at Lumen Gentium. We have a fantastic young teacher, a gentleman named Noah Thornburg, who's doing some great stuff in this way, right? So he has one of the assignments that his students do regularly, is something called a metaphrasis or
Hmm.
metaphrasis. And what that is taking a work of poetry, or taking a passage of poetry, and paraphrasing it, right, putting it into language of the student's own. And what that requires the students to do is to go back to the text, look at it very carefully, weigh the clauses, and untangle the syntax very carefully, so that they can appropriate the meaning there, the substance there, into their own language. Um,
Hmm.
he's done another assignment. He recently his students were studying Montaigne, the essays of Montaigne, and rather than ask the students to analyze, or say what's tell me something about Montaigne's skeptical view of life, or something along those lines. It was he invited the students to choose a topic, right, in the similar to the kinds of topics that Montaigne writes about, and then to write about it, and use Montaigne's style as a kind of as a
Right.
model for them, right? And kind of as they got stuck in a certain place, like he would tell, like, go back to Montaigne. What would Montaigne do at this point, right? How would he proceed, given this place that you've arrived in your essay? And so that's a fantastic example of what you were describing there, of Aristotelian mimesis, right? Going back to the masters, and seeing how the masters thought through these questions in their writing, and trying to appropriate that, or trying to invite the students to appropriate that. We spoke earlier about this. Oftentimes, the fear there is like, well, you're hindering the development of the student's own voice, right?
Right.
And there's something kind of very quixotic about that, right? The idea that students, 13-year-olds spontaneously generate their own literary voice, is really the kind of thing that somebody who hasn't spent a lot of time with 13-year-olds would think, right? I mean, you need to provide structures, you need to provide them with models, before they can do that. And so but you have to provide them with lots of them, right? And
Right.
eventually, by trying on Montaigne's voice, and then trying on Bacon's voice, and then trying on the voice of Hazlitt, right? And trying on all these different voices, that's when they begin to find their own, right? That's when
It's
they
true.
so really, what happens when it's the case that you have a writer who is derivative, or who is kind of clearly like imitative of one particular style or writer. The problem there is they haven't done enough imitation, right? They've done too little. They've limited their imitation to one or two models, rather than absorbed a whole range of them.
I'm having this epiphany. So I'm thinking about how we often approach writing in this formulaic way where we look at it more as a tool, but writing is an art. And
Right.
as an art, if we think about how the great artists learned art, they had teachers and they modeled after them,
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
imitated them. They learned how to paint by copying the greats.
Yeah.
What happened then was once they learned the techniques of copying the greats, voila, they developed their own voice.
Correct. Right.
And so maybe some of these painters, you can tell by looking at them, oh, they must have studied under so and so. And it's the same with music. Oh, they must have studied under Beethoven or Mozart, you know?
Right.
And so they do pick up perhaps some of the nuances from their masters, but that's a good thing,
Yeah.
right? There's nothing bad about that. That's a good thing. And I think about how I think what that does is it's kind of like the text is the apprentice to the student. I think what that does is it actually builds a confidence in the student because they start to wrestle with these trying to imitate and they were like, oh, I did a pretty good job. Maybe I can write. Right. And I've spoken with Dr. Greg Roper at University of Dallas about this. He wrote a really great book on imitation writing. Can't remember what it's called right now, but I'll put it in the show notes. And it's got some great little exercises in it that at least can help a teacher understand what this might look like, how you might approach
Right.
teaching in this way. I know he said some of the texts are a little bit difficult for some of the junior high school students, but I think if a teacher were to get like his book and walk themselves through it, they could start to maybe have a practical example of how to teach in this way. But I think you're really onto something. I think the idea that a classical school even needs a writing curriculum is questionable. If you are passionate about teaching well and getting your students to be exposed to that which is true and good and beautiful, and English is your topic that you're going to teach, this actually should be a more natural way of teaching that could open up a lot of joy for you, the teacher, and your students. How would you encourage maybe a teacher who is wondering, well, how can I do this?
Yeah. So I guess the straightforward answer to that is the same way everybody's done it for centuries, right? As you said, there's nothing complicated about it, right? There's nothing. I mean, there's nothing complicated about the whole classical ed approach, right? It's in some ways, what we're trying to do is find really good books, read them with our students, and ask our students to think in serious and prolonged ways about them, right? And so what I have in mind here, like I mean, for instance, like the kinds of assignments that I described are really they're not ones that, as you said, require any kind of curricular materials. They're not ones that even need to be done in any kind of systematic fashion. But right when you read something with your students that has the power to capture their imagination, has the power to capture their attention, has something substantive to say to them, pause on that, right? Let them work through that, right? Let them paraphrase it, right? Um, let them imitate it, right? Let them write something when you read a sonnet, right? Or you read, you're going through some Shakespeare sonnets and you're seeing the kids respond to it. Let them write a sonnet, right?
Hmm.
Don't make them write an analysis of the sonnets in order to squeeze the life and the joy out of that
Right.
task of writing a sonnet. Get them to write a sonnet, and then let them experience the value of that literature from the inside, right? Like so.
Hmm.
So one, I mean, if you want to teach a student to appreciate Shakespeare, or you want to teach an adult to appreciate Shakespeare, have them write a couple lines of iambic pentameter, right? Find
Right.
see how hard that is, right? See and have some sense of the skill and the artifice that's engaged, but also like the what that's about, right? How you're trying to find a kind of balanced and sonorous language that is in some way elevated above the language of the quotidian, right? And
Right.
why you would do that, like what kind of intellectual and spiritual instincts are aroused in the process of doing that. And if you do that and then you go back to Shakespeare, it'll make a whole lot more sense, and you'll be able to appreciate again now from the inside, right? So I think one basic thing I think is worth pointing out at this point is like, again, when we think about what we're like trying to do in general, right, as classical educators, right, I think in some sense we're trying to invite our students into a hallowed tradition, right, a tradition that spans centuries and millennia, right, and we're trying to invite them to become part of that tradition, not to
Mhm.
study it, right? Not to know about it or to be scholars of it, but to be partakers of it, right?
I love
Uh,
that. Yeah,
to
that's what a classical education is supposed to be.
Yeah,
Right.
right. So like again, like why I tell my students in that poetry class, right? They read poetry in their humanities class in their other classes, right? And there they do study it a little bit more like from a scholarly approach, right? To try and make sense of it. But like in poetry class, again, we'll read a sonnet, we'll talk about the structure of sonnet, and then it's like, okay, go write a sonnet, all right?
Exactly.
Go do this thing. And what I tell them is like, okay, in this class, when you study Shakespeare, you're not studying him as a scholar, you're studying him as a peer, right? You're trying to do the sort of thing that
I
he
love that.
does,
I
right?
love that. I love that you're telling them that he's a friend.
Yeah, yes, you're rubbing
Yeah.
elbows with
Yeah.
Shakespeare and with Yeats,
I
and right,
love it.
you're becoming part of the tradition that they
And
are
that's so
that they're part of.
beautiful. Okay,
Yeah,
I'm just gonna say it. I say it on every podcast. This is very, very Charlotte Mason. To just
right.
throw that in there for anyone who
Yeah,
hasn't read her. This is exactly what she's saying in her philosophy of education. All of it. Any Charlotte Mason fans out there, you're gonna be shouting hallelujah for this interview. Um, so I have one more question, I think, kind of in regard to this down with the essay, and then I want to
sure,
move into the poetic idea a little more. You've been talking about poetic, but I kind of want to get more
sure.
into it. So, but I love the art of rhetoric, and so I want you to talk a little bit about uh, how it's opposed to this research paper. How is the art of rhetoric? We've kind of been saying that. I want you
Yeah,
to go a little deeper into it, and I also want you to talk about, is there a justification for doing both? Like, what about the science teacher assigning a
right.
research project? Is that okay? Are you just more specifically addressing that the English teacher shouldn't be so focused on this? Tell us more in
Yeah,
that realm.
yeah, and that's a good it's a good point to make and a good qualification I should make, which is that, yeah, I am primarily talking about writing in a humanities, setting, and in fact, actually, part of a big part of my, and antipathy towards the research model is that it is kind of a scientific model, right? That's kind of
Mhm.
smuggled into humanities right, study, right? So I mean, so if you think about it, right, the idea of having a thesis or a hypothesis which then gets proved through evidence is a very kind of scientific model, and it really doesn't apply in a humanities setting where the idea of proof is not really applicable, right? It's not really the proper model for understanding. It's and the idea of evidence as opposed to argumentation is also not really a proper model for understanding the use of sources in a humanistic way. So yeah, so in a science in a science setting, yes, the research paper can provide a more suitable model. Though even there, I wonder, I mean, if you look at there's some great science writing that doesn't look anything like a research paper, right? If anybody's read like Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, or like some of the essays of Richard Feynman on like modern physics, right? They actually don't look like research paper that model at all either. So I'll kind of defer to the science teachers on that one. But yeah, I should make it clear. I'm really talking about writing in a humanities setting. So in that in that saying, so what like why is it different from how does the research approach differ from a rhetorical approach? So I'm gonna here I'll shock you, Adrian, and maybe shock some of your readers here by citing the College Board as
Mm.
as a source of doing something right here, right? Of providing us with a kind of model, all right? Um, which it's not the sort of thing classical educators typically do, right? But for years, I used to teach the AP Lang class, right? The AP Language and Composition class, which was like a rhetoric class, right? And on the test for the AP Lang, the students had to write 3 essays. One of them was called a synthesis essay. And the goal of the synthesis essay, what they did, they gave the students a prompt, some question. The questions actually could off many years were quite interesting and ones that students could kind of ruminate on fruitfully, I thought. And then they would give them 6 sources that they had to read, and the sources represented a variety of positions on that question, right? and the goal, the judging criteria of the essay required the students to navigate their way through a panoply of perspectives on that question, right? So in other words, they were not being asked to provide a thesis and then go look in for support for that thesis in the sources, right? Which, if you
Ah,
think, it's really,
interesting.
if you think about it, that's really just a kind of model for special pleading, right? Like, I think this, I'm going to go find everybody who agrees with me on this and cite them, and then declare that my thesis has been proven, right? Um,
Right.
the synthesis, as they ask the students actually to navigate through the variety of perspectives and say, okay, here's, and first of all, like, and to stake out their position on the question itself, right? So they were right. I mean, the primary thing they were doing was not writing about the sources. They were writing in response to the question. They were writing about the question. And then they were using the sources to kind of elaborate and delineate their own position on that. So they would go to one source and say, this person has made this point. I agree. This elaborates the point I'm trying to make. This person kind of agrees, but not really, because he's saying this. But this person, she's totally off base. And this is what, right? So you kind of navigate your way through the all the different perspectives on this question to delineate your own position. And in my mind, again, it's not often that as classical educators we're going to say, like, the College Board is providing us a kind of model, but that is a kind of, to me, that does represent a model of how you would use sources in writing, right? And I don't think all writing requires sources, but when we want students to use sources in their writing, that's the way I think we want them to use them, because in that way they're engaging with the kind of the community of thought on any given
Right.
question. And that's what it means, I think, to be writing in a rhetorical mode, right? When you're writing research, right, and when you're writing in that mode, right, you are writing invited in some kind of subtle way. And I don't know, I might be overstating the case a bit, but right, in some way, you are being invited to write as an expert, right? You've done the research, you've gained the data on this
Right.
point, right? And so you're addressing your reader as somebody who has a kind of knowledge that the reader is lacking, right? And there is a kind of a habit, it's just in our public discourse, of people talking like that, of people
Yeah.
addressing the public like that, right? From the stance of the expert, right? And I'm not blaming that all on the research paper, but I think that it's consonant with that assignment. Whereas in the rhetorical mode, you're just being asked to write as one citizen or as one member of the community to other members of the community, thinking through alongside them the parameters of the question at hand, right? So I think that's the main benefit, I think, of inviting students to write in the rhetorical mode, right? So one of the one of the strangest experiences I had, it was early on in my teaching career. I learned about the rhetorical tradition. I was trying to kind of adopt some of the practices into my own instruction. And I looked at, I remember reading Quintilian.
Hmm.
I read the Ad Horenum, which is
Mm.
thought to be by
Cicero.
Cicero, but yeah,
Yeah.
I think the authorship there is debatable. But then I picked up Aristotle's rhetoric,
Yeah.
right? And I thought there would be stuff about writing in there, and it's largely a work of psychology, right? Old people will respond to certain arguments this way, and young people will respond this way, right? And people of this status will. And I was reading, I'm like, Aristotle, when are we going to get to the writing instruction, right? But then I realized, like, much later, actually, I realized what he was getting at there was, like, you can't argue without some kind of basic. You can't argue on human issues, on issues that have a bearing on human life, without a profound understanding of human nature, right?
Right.
You cannot persuade, you cannot enlighten the minds of other persons without a profound understanding of personhood. All right. And so again, I think that's the importance of working in the rhetorical mode.
And that's why we call these humanities courses.
Yes.
Yes. And that's why you said earlier, we need to be writing about, what did you say? About human living ideas, not about writing about other writing,
Right.
but like actually coming up with ideas and responses to those ideas, right?
Right.
As we transition into some principles for classical writing program, I think it's a great idea for me to read one of my favorite poems that I do at a lot of my teacher trainings,
Sure.
because I think this poem bridges us into the next topic, but it also summarizes exactly everything you said. This poem is called Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. And he says, I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press it against, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. And I just adore that poem and use it at teacher training. We read it 3 times and I ask, what's your favorite part of the poem and why? And what does this tell us about teaching poetry?
Yeah, it's funny. So I used to, a friend of mine and myself used to run professional development seminars for English teachers nearby here, and primarily focus on poetry. And my friend would always start our seminars with that poem.
Because it's so profound. The message
Yeah,
is so perfect.
yeah,
You
yeah.
actually said a few things in your last I don't know, 20 minutes ago you said something that was almost exactly from the poem. I was like, "Oh my gosh, that's exactly what that poem says."
Yeah, and I
um
think I mentioned this in in one of our earlier conversations. There's an essay floating around the ether somewhere by the poet Dana Gioia where he writes about how a focus on and analyzing poetry and having that be the primary response to poetry has drained the life out of and a large reason why people don't really love poetry anymore is that they've associate with that task of analysis rather than just mere appreciation, not mirror, not all mirror, but appreciation. And I think he's onto something there.
well, right. So that bridges me into what we're going to go into with your next essay. You kind of say the same thing. Explain why a poetic approach to teaching writing is actually classical.
Yeah, so one of the things I mentioned in the essay that you mentioned earlier, right? So when I remember, like as an English student, right, as an English major, right, like it was a kind of um, a basic dictum that poetry was kind of the preeminent form of writing, right? It was kind of or the paradigmatic form of writing, right? That in some way, it was kind of the most basic and even primal literary expression of our most initial and basic responses to human experience, right? And there's a lot of there's a lot of philosophical reflection on that point. Like if you ever read uh, the New Science by Jean Baptiste Vico, right? That's his whole argument, right? That in some way civilization itself grows out of like the poetic impulse, right? That it
Hmm.
begins as an expression of this drive towards creation, this drive towards building up a social civil world in which our souls can be at home. And so there's a sense. And then and of course then the other on the other hand it's like poetry is also kind of the form of writing that makes the most use of the resources of language, right, that exploits the figurative and syntactical resources of language to their most exhaustive extent, right? And so in both of those ways, in poetry is kind of paradigmatic, kind of primary, and all other forms of writing are kind of derivative. If you go back, if you look at the earliest writing that survives from a lot of cultures and civilizations around the world, it is quite often poetic, right? So that's some evidence of the kind of basic or fundamental nature of poetry. But then, so that was like what I learned as an English major, right? And then going into the English classroom in school, right? What we were constantly asking our students to do was write essays, right? Was not to do this kind of basic and fundamental kind of writing, but actually to do writing that was downstream or derivative of that, right? Which is not an argument against essay writing, right? Or about the importance of essay writing, but a, an argument or I guess I want to say an expression of hesitation about teaching the essay in isolation from the poetic sources that ought to give it life, right? So a sense of play, and even an aesthetic sensibility that is that we associate with poetry. I think that that's something that gets totally shunted aside when we ask our students to do the kind of writing that they typically do in school. And as a matter of fact, like that's the only kind of thing that will make the task of writing appealing to students, right? So again, like as classical educators, like we put a lot of emphasis on students learning to take delight in their studies, right? Which is not the same thing as doing things in a kind of carefree or a way with low standards, or it's to train the students to actually find a joy in the hard work of study. All right. And when it comes to writing, one of the key ways that you do that is by developing a sense of play, by developing a delight in the texture of a sentence, right? By having the joy of creating character, of creating voice, of creating style. All right. Um, and if you take that away from them completely, if you deprive them of that experience completely, they're bound to find the writing task onerous. And of course, most students these days do find it. And that's not to say I don't want to be I don't want to sound too idealistic about this, right? I mean, the writing is hard and students will find it difficult, and there's no magic wand to make that go away. But insofar as we can make it more appealing, and then insofar as we can make it less onerous, the way to do that is by engaging their sense of play. They're engaging
It's true.
their sense of their aesthetic sensibility. And we don't do that at all.
Right, and it should be it shouldn't be just something done in K-5. This needs
Yes,
to be done
yes,
all the way through to the end. And in
yes,
fact, I would just challenge some boards, headmasters, teachers, administrators. If you on your classical school website claim that you are giving your students an education in truth, goodness, and beauty, then this is how you should be teaching. Because what you said they should be training them in the joy of creating. And if you're not doing that, then you have not been embracing what beauty means.
correct. Yeah, I'm very glad you said that, because that I think there is a sense, even probably somewhere in the back of my mind, I probably have this sense as well, right? That it is early on, right, in the elementary stages when you are trying to engage their sense of play, right? That you're and that that kind of wanes as time goes on, and then they get to high school, it's down to the the hard work of high school, and there's something to that, right? I mean, we recognize, right, there is a way you adjust your instruction as students progress, and the tasks become significantly more difficult as they progress, and students can find that to be there is a way in which the tasks grow harder, and students can become more and more frustrated with some of the tasks put in front of them as time goes on. But again, the response to that as educators is to preserve some of that sense of play, right? As students as they progress, even into high school, even beyond, right? I mean, so like again, even in college, like where again, like academic writing is kind of the paradigm, which is this kind of bloodless and lifeless kind of writing, which again doesn't match up with any of the kind of writing that any of us enjoy reading. Like that article that you mentioned before was actually written in response to an article by another scholar who was writing about like how much he hated doing academic writing as a professor, right? Not as a student, but as a
Mhm.
professor, right? So like that's not even a model for what real scholarship would look like. And certainly like when we go back to like if we read somebody like Montaigne, or we read somebody like Rabelais, or Sir Thomas Browne, like that their writing doesn't look anything like the kind of academic writing that comes out. So there's a
That's
sense of
true.
play. There's a sense of kind of vitality, of vibrancy, right? Of playing with
Yeah.
the language, playing with ideas, playing with experience, and doing so in a kind of joyful way. And that's the kind of writing that we want to prepare our students to do. And it doesn't stop in high
Yeah.
school. It doesn't stop in elementary school. It doesn't stop at any
Ever.
point in an intelligent person's life.
You're right. In fact, I'm thinking, like, I immediately was thinking, oh, some of the authors that we can tell never stopped playing would be like Mark Twain,
Yeah.
George MacDonald, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien. They never stopped playing with language and
Right.
writing. But then again, I never even realized until you just said Montaigne. I was like, oh, even the philosophers, in some sense, their writing is so beautiful and appealing to us because they're playing with ideas.
Yeah.
They're they're wrestling with them, they're juggling with these ideas and tossing them around and letting us kind of peek into their thoughts about those ideas.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
interesting.
So I think that's something like, that is a kind of basically poetic drive, right?
Sure.
Kind of the play drive, as Schiller described it, right? This
Yeah.
drive to create, this drive to kind of bring new structures of thought into the world, and that's kind of what I'm suggesting. Like even when they're writing essays, something like that should be going on.
Yeah, in fact, I had never read Schiller, and I am listening right now to this wonderful the great courses. You've heard of the great courses.
Yep,
Okay, so I'm
sure.
listening to one that I bought on Audible called From Plato to Postmodernism: Understanding the Essence of Literature and Role of the Author, led by Professor Lou Marcos, whom I love. He's been
Sure,
on our
sure.
show, and I've actually emailed him and said, this is such an amazing lecture series. I need to have you on the podcast, like on 8 episodes, to talk about this, right? We're going to have him on maybe 2 more to talk about this, but he talks about Schiller and the play drive, and it's just
Yeah,
so brilliant. And I'm like,
yeah.
oh, we need to have you on the podcast to talk about what does this look like in the classroom. And I think you're kind of sharing it here.
Yeah, and
Uh,
so and this again, this is like an important qualification to make, right? Because there's a way of hearing that is, that would not be what I'm trying to say, right? There's a way of hearing like that students should be playing in the classroom,
right.
which sounds like unrigorous,
It
that
does.
sounds like, and which is not.
Unschooling.
Yes, right? So again, so Schiller is a very good, response to that, right? Because his the idea there behind the play drive is like when we play, right? When we exercise that creative freedom, we always do so in structured ways, right? And I think
Yes.
I think he takes some of that from Kant, but like the idea is like
Yes.
we don't like when we play a game, right? The first thing we do is we set up the rules, right? Even as kids,
Right.
right? So we're never just like running like haphazardly around, at least past a certain age, right? But we set up certain rules. We play in structured ways. So like poetry is kind of the preeminent example of this, right? When we want to express our strong emotions in response to some activity, we really don't just throw out words, right? We look for the right structure for those thoughts, for those emotions. We look for the linguistic structure that's going to
That's right.
serve as the proper, vehicle for the expression of those words, and that's why it's really, kind of, um, poisonous and problematic when teachers instruct their students to do that sort of thing, right? To just throw out your word, right? Just say whatever you think,
Yeah,
about the.
this nonchalant creative writing,
Yes,
write
exactly.
whatever you want in your
Right, just
journal. Yeah.
express yourself. It's the same thing like in art classes when they're instead of teaching them to just draw in a kind of formal way, it's just like throw the paint on the page however you want,
Yeah,
right?
this is
Because
a very modern,
it
postmodern.
is. It is, and it's actually very, it's very hostile to some very profound instincts that we have in us, which again, like is very much what Schiller is reflecting on there. Is like we actually don't create like that, right? We don't, want to create like that. We have a drive to create, but we have a drive to create a kind of structured world, right? So the one of the figures I mentioned, one of the authors I mentioned in, I think it was in the second essay, who again is probably not the kind of author I think, lots of, classical educators would think of, but a writer named Francis Christensen,
Mhm.
in the 60s wrote an article. Let me try to get the title right. I think the generative towards a generative rhetoric of the sentence, and one of your sharp listeners could look that up and correct me if I got that wrong. But
We'll put it in the show notes. Yeah.
sure, sure. So, but his basic point there is like when you're teaching students to write, the very very basic thing that you're doing, that you're asking them to do, is a process of addition. He puts it right, to say more. Right, so like they write about, even if they're writing about text, right? They say this, the character, felt this, and you're saying, well, elaborate on that. Tell me more, or give me an example, right? Say more about that, right? Or they're writing a poem, and they write some lines. You say, well, you need a metaphor to kind of convey, like say more here, right? So his basic point is like you're always trying, the basic thing you're trying to drive students to do, is to say more, to elaborate, to
Right.
expand and create. And his point is that what we want to do, and he's thinking really primarily at the level of the sentence, but we want to give them generative structures, right? Ways of saying more, but saying more in a kind of structured manner, right? Not just kind of blurting, like we're not trying to get them to just blurt
Right.
things, but we want to give them the capacity to to build upon their thoughts in structured ways. And he talks about, like, he has a certain kind of syntax in mind, which I might depart from him a little bit on that. But he said, you give the students this kind of syntax, and you say, put a clause here, put a prepositional phrase here, and and adding that grammatical structure, you're inviting them to create, right, to say more, right, to generate an idea, but they're doing so in a kind of structured manner. And you can take that insight, I think, and expand it all the way up from the level of the sentence to the level of the paragraph to the level of the
Mhm.
argument as a whole. And, like, you can take things like Aristotle's categories, and you can look at them as ways of saying more, right, but saying
Right.
more in a structured way, right? Say more about this thing, say more about this event, the when and the where of it, right? Or you can
Mhm.
take the rhetorical topics, right? Cause and effect, comparison, and you can say, okay, say more, but say it in this kind of structured way. So again, it's
Right.
all this basic poetic drive towards structured creation, is what I have in mind, and what I'm espousing as a kind of root approach to writing.
I love it. I want to talk to some teachers here who are thinking, this sounds all great. How do I do this? Okay. So, in my mind, with all the years I've been training teachers and working through this, pretty much the philosophy that I work through is the same. So, for K-5, the exposure to a lot of poetry and a lot of stories that are well written and having them narrate out loud, like this is the foundation right here. Because then when they get to the point where they can take and write their narrations and begin, they have a structure because they've been exposed to the structure of beautiful poems and beautiful stories. And so it's not like it's a structure they've analyzed, but it's a structure they've been immersed in.
Yes.
And because they've been immersed in it, they will then be able to begin um, playing with it, I guess, if you will, and playing with those structures. And so, like, I'm a fan of start reading Shakespeare, beautiful stories of Shakespeare for children, when they're in like third, fourth grade, and all the way up through. And then by the time they get to sixth, seventh, eighth grade, they're familiar with the plot stories and structures of Shakespeare from the Mary and Charles Lamb's version, which is written beautifully.
Mhm.
And then they can tackle the real Shakespeare in middle school. And guess what? By the time they're in ninth grade, you could have them easily write something in the style and structure of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And some of the sonnets, reading those sonnets in middle school, many of them, reading them, just playing with them. And then again, easily, it's not hard for them. It becomes a very easy, organic transition for these students so that they are now being trained in the joy of
Yeah.
creating because they've been immersed in the beauty of this language for so many years. And instead of drilling this out of them, just allowing them to experience the
Yeah.
beauty of it in reading it, narrating it, acting it out in their narrations. Fables, I mean, there's so much you can do with fables in every grade. I mean, they're simple. You can have those. Those are easy to imitate, easy to play with and structure, act them out in class, then rewrite them with different characters in a different setting in the same style as learning how to imitate a style. It's very easy with, I think, poetry, and especially if you've been reading, like say in third grade, you've got three or four major poets you're reading, and then in fourth grade, you got three or four major poets reading. You become familiar with the style of those poets. So then it
Yeah.
becomes not that hard to say, write me a retelling from something they've learned in history class, but
Yeah.
write it in the style of Wordsworth.
Yeah. Yeah.
They actually can do it because they know Wordsworth. They've been immersed in it. And I think this is to me what a real beautiful education in the classical tradition really looks like.
Yeah, and I think it's worth. I mean, it's worth pointing out, right? To ask students to write in the style of Wordsworth is not to suppose that they're going to write poems that come out as good as Wordsworth, right?
Right,
Um,
exactly.
and nor is that necessary, right? Once in a while, you do get a gem, right? You do get one that you say, wow, right? That really is something on par with some outstanding poetry. But most of the time, it's passable, right? Which is exactly what it should be, because the task is, I mean, the goal is not to for the students to create something that's that is attains some level of perfection. The value of that practice is internal to the practice itself, right? The practice of trying to create harmonious language, of trying to order your thoughts, and order your response to the world such that you maintain the capacity to transcend the chaos and the discord of experience, and to appropriate it from a perspective that in some ways transcends that chaos and discord in the way that poet tries to do, to have to just engage in that practice, nourishes intellectual instincts that have a value in and of themselves, whether or not the poem comes out looking good on the other end. All right. So one of my favorite stories is in China. In fact, under I believe it was the Ming Dynasty. Right. And again, one of your, I know you have a sharp audience. I'm sure somebody's going to correct me on that, but I think that was the right dynasty, right? That there, there were examinations that were administered for entry into the civil service. All right, and they were very intense, and people had to travel to the capital and would spend days, mostly kind of displaying their command of the Confucian classics. Right, but one of the tasks that they were required to do was write a poem. Right? They had right. I mean, just it's funny to think about, right? Imagine like what our federal bureaucracy would look like if everybody had to write a passable sonnet to get a job at the Department of Energy, right? If you want to shrink government, that would be one way to do it very quickly, right? But the idea there is like that none of those students were writing anything that was bound to be anthologized, or was going to be considered, but it was just
Right.
there's a certain kind of attainment, right? That students were expected to display in their command of a certain kind of formal writing. And in the West, of course, there's plenty of examples of that sort of thing. I mean, for centuries, right, being able to write a few decent quatrains about the woman that you were in love with was just kind of a social attainment, right, a social expectation, and very little of that was worthy of preservation, or would qualify as a kind of hallmark of the art. But it was what was gained through the practice of writing that sort of thing, that was the aim of writing that sort of thing. And the idea that there was a kind of balance, or composure to the soul that was nurtured or cultivated through the practice of writing poetry, was the goal of writing poetry, right? For most students.
I love this. I think I want to close our podcast episode with rereading the quote I opened with, and then I want to ask you about your favorite book or quote.
Sure.
So I'm going to close our conversation by rereading this quote because it might make more sense now. You said, a good writer is one who is conversant with his sources, who thinks about life's perennial mysteries alongside them, and invites his reader into the polyphonous discussion he is already undertaking with his sources. A good high school writing assignment is one that invigorates just such a discussion. We do not want our students to write about books, but to write about life, using books to expand and synthesize their thoughts. How far removed is the ubiquitous research paper from any such conception? And I think our listeners will now understand what that means. I really appreciate that you just kind of like walked us through all of this. It's so important to the conversation. Um, so I'm going to close by asking you, what is a quote from a book that has had a huge impact on you, or
Sure.
what book do you wish you had read sooner in your life?
Sure. Yeah. So I pulled out a quote that I've used multiple times before. So at the risk of being repetitive here, it's just because it had such a clear bearing on this conversation. I couldn't think of another quote that was quite as appropriate. So and I think it as we kind of conclude here, it's a quote that maybe will allow me to kind of put this discussion of writing in the context of some of the larger aims of classical education. So it comes from a writer named Hugh Blair. He was a professor of rhetoric in the 18th century. He was part of the Johnson Circle, that group. He wrote a work called Lectures on Rhetoric and Belles Lettres, and in the first of those lectures, there's a paragraph that I think is germane here. So I'll read this one, and again I've quoted it numerous times in numerous essays. So if if there's any listeners who read my essays and have come across this and think I'm being repetitive, I'll apologize in advance. But Blair writes, all that regards the study of eloquence and composition merits the higher attention upon this account, that is intimately connected with the improvement of our intellectual powers. For I must be allowed to say that when we are employed after a proper manner in the study of composition, we are cultivating reason itself. True rhetoric and sound logic are very nearly allied. The study of arranging and expressing our thoughts with propriety teaches to think as well as to speak accurately. By putting our sentiments into words, we always conceive them more distinctly. Everyone who has the slightest acquaintance with composition knows that when he expresses himself ill on any subject, when his arrangement is loose and his sentences become feeble, the defects of his style can, almost on every occasion, be traced back to his indistinct conception of the subject. So close is the connection between thoughts and the words in which they are clothed. So I I love that quote for many reasons, right? But the basic reason that um, as he points out, right, in teaching right, we've been talking about teaching writing this whole time, but what we're really talking about is thinking, right, thinking, teaching thought,
Hmm.
right, and writing is, to my mind, the practice that we do with students that is the most efficacious practice for teaching thinking, right? But it's specifically thinking about human life and human experience and the parameters of human life and human experience, the moral, the spiritual, the intellectual, and aesthetic dimensions of human experience. And writing and language itself and all the linguistic practices that we do in a classical school are all aimed towards teaching our students to reason specifically about human things, about human life, right? And I think it's an important point to make, because I think for myself, and I think for you, and for many people in the classical education movement, right, the task that I think we conceive ourselves as engaged in is not merely one of school reform, right? That's part of it, right? That's part of what we're doing, and God knows our schools need reform, right? Um, but I think, I think all of us, or many of us, have a sense that we're living in a period that needs something quite a bit more, right? That we're living in a period of great cultural and spiritual deprivation. We're living through a real crisis of civilization, right? And what we're doing in classical education is planting some seeds that can really sprout into something more like the beginnings of something like a renewal of
Hmm.
civilized society, right? Of civil society, right? And there's a very long story to be told about how we got here, and um, what's led to the deprivation that we're all sensing around us. But in some very kind of broad way, and you'd have to invite me back for another episode to kind of lay all this out. But in some very broad way, um, I think what's happened is we've been convinced, or we've come to convince ourselves, that we can reason or think about human life through the same methods and the same approaches that we can think about anything else, right? That the
Hmm.
same methodologies, the same approaches, the same intellectual structures that we can apply to any other form of existence are applicable to making sense of human existence. And I think, as students and teachers of the humanities specifically, I think the humanities rest upon a bedrock commitment that the human must be understood and comprehended in specifically human terms, right? That the study of the humanities is a study of what is uniquely human, and that the sorts of methodologies and approaches that are required to understanding the moral and spiritual dimensions of human life are not the approaches and methodologies that are appropriate to understanding biological or physical life as such. All right. And so the unique human capacity, the instrument, the vehicle into the and the source of the uniquely human social, civil, religious world is language, right? That's the unique
Right.
capacity in us. And by training a capacity in language, by training a facility in language, we are inculcating in students the ability to think about human life in the only terms, through the only approach and methodology that can make sense of human life. And so as we talk about writing, as we conclude our conversation about writing, I think that's an important point to make as we conclude.
I think, Mark, that what you just said is exactly what David Hicks is saying in Norms and Nobility.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's why norms and nobility, that's why we keep talking about norms and nobility in the classical ed world. We all talk about this is like one of the most important seminal works you could possibly read if you want to understand classical education. It's exactly, I mean, you summarized a lot of what he's saying
Yeah.
is that.
Yeah, and it's funny. I have some stuff, some references to Hicks in my notes here, which we didn't get to. But yes, I mean, his even just his one of the things that when I first read his work, there's I guess a little bit surprising to me is the emphasis on style. He refers repeatedly to
Yes,
style and to cultivating style in students. And he's not even specifically referring to that in terms of writing, but just in terms of the way students think.
think
Uh,
and how
yeah,
they live, the choices they, everything.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah. And that's
yes,
and that goes to again the idea that that's something that can only be cultivated through an appreciation of what is unique to the style capable natures of human beings.
that's right. And bringing out the good and the true and the beautiful, all
Yeah.
three, not just the
Yeah.
good, not just the true, not just the beautiful, but they have to be well ordered and working together. And I often feel like people tend to focus more on truth in classical schools and logic and truth, and the beauty is just, and we see it in a lot of the architecture of the schools even, which is sad. And so yeah, that's a whole, architecture is another couple podcasts.
Right. Yes, though I have to say, like, so my first experiences with classical education, though, like, so when I visited, the first couple classical schools, one of the very first things I noticed, and one of the very first differences was just the pictures on the walls, right?
Yes, the way
And
you
so
decorate your school,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah,
So that I
in
mean,
your
so
classroom.
there's a lot. I think there's a lot of folks out there who get that, right?
Because we're shaping the tastes, we're
Yeah,
cultivating their thoughts, and it needs to be with the good and the true and the beautiful.
yeah,
And there is a truth to beauty. So,
absolutely. Yeah,
again, and I had an episode on that with Dr. Matthew Post on beauty, and I need to do more topics on beauty because it's such a foundational part that I think is lacking in a lot of schools. I think a lot of people are getting it though, and they're starting to bring it back in.
I think so. I think so.
And that, but poetry is probably the best, biggest, most important means of beginning to bring, playing with poetry is the beginning to bring beauty back into the pedagogy for sure.
For
So,
sure. Absolutely.
well, thank you. This was great, and I encourage our readers to subscribe to your Substack, the Classical Corner, and follow your writings because I think you've got some provocative ideas that are right in line with what I'm trying to help our listeners understand as well.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks for having me on. This is a lot of
Yeah.
fun.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for listening. You can get involved in a few ways. There's a Facebook page where we actively discuss the ideas around classical education. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/classical education. And if you